Hello, friends. I'm DM Nell, and this is another one of my Shadow the Demon Lord chats. Thank you for joining me today. And I would like to spend some time with you today to discuss my Shadow the Demon Lord campaign. I had one of my sessions, or one of my videos, where I gave a broad overview of what I want to do with the campaign. I'm not gonna redo that. Instead, what I'd like to do is talk about the first couple of sessions that I had and how those went. Now, why am I doing this? Well, one of my favorite types of podcasts or videos on YouTube are the ones where DMs or GMs walk us through their campaigns or do a campaign diary. Matt Colville famously does this. He's a very popular YouTuber. But there are a few others, and as far as podcast goes, I favor the Tome Show, Behind the DM Screen, where the three DMs talk about their games on a weekly or monthly basis. And so, since that's the type of video and podcast that I enjoy watching and listening to, I decided that I want to do a little bit of that myself. Not so that I can listen to myself, but I figure that there are probably folks out there like me that enjoy that type of experience. And sadly, there's not a whole lot of it. At least not a whole lot that I can find. So towards that end, I wanted to add to what few options there are out there, and make it specific, of course, to Shadow the Demon Lord, because that's what this video series is all about. So what I have here is my Blogger account, and this is where I actually keep track of all my campaign diaries. I've actually had this Blogger account for quite a while. It goes back many years, and actually looks like some of the old content may have fallen off, but I do have content going back to, looks like 2016. My big fat head is in the way there, so I can't see all the dates, but at any rate, my big fat head is even bigger. So at any rate, I wanted to go through the campaign diaries. For one thing, just to show you how I do those, and for another thing, because my memory is not always awesome, so I do need to refresh myself on occasion. All right, so for this campaign, just to remind you of what I'm trying to accomplish here, I have a mega campaign set up. So my plan is to have at least 10, maybe 11 separate campaigns, all of them going anywhere from 0 level to 10th level or higher. And that series of campaigns will chronicle the destruction and the downfall of the Shadow of the Demon Lord world, which is called Earth, URTH. And the reason I'm doing that is because the way Shadow of the Demon Lord is set up is you can play through an apocalypse scenario in 10 or 11 sessions. But I was part of this Kickstarter back when it first started in 2014 or 2015. I have hundreds of PDFs that go with this game, and I don't want to start and end a campaign in 11 sessions and then have to migrate to another world to keep playing this campaign or to keep playing this game system. Plus, the world is an interesting world. I like the world the way it's been set up and presented. So I wanted to use it to its to the fullest extent possible. And given that there are so many supplements that outline different areas of the world, you can't do that in an 11-session campaign. So that's why I'm doing a series of campaigns that are linked that again chronicle the demise of the world. So this would be the second campaign of my mega campaign, and the first campaign was actually Tales of the Demon Lord. I did that a couple years back, and that was actually my first Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign that I ran, using the Tales of the Demon Lord adventure that was published by Schwalbe Entertainment, and it was it was a fun session, but the I had no plans for a mega campaign at that point. But the way that it left off, it kind of was a really good uh, way to kick off a mega campaign, because the way that campaign ended, and spoilers in case anybody's planning on playing through that campaign, even though I changed it pretty dramatically when I ran it. But anyway, that campaign is based around the story of the Brotherhood of Shadows trying to open a portal so that the Demon Lord could come into this reality and destroy it. So they didn't succeed, but they did manage to get a portal open briefly, just long enough to be basically a shining beacon for the Demon Lord to see and to edge ever closer to this reality. And so that's what I'm using basically to kick off the mega campaign. I also um, I also started in that campaign. I also alluded to uh, the downfall of the empire. That is the core. If you go through the supplements and the core rule book for the world background, that's that's one of the current events, is that the orcs have risen up against the emperor, slain the emperor, and a new orc or the orc king took over the empire. And kind of threw everything into chaos. Now, in the book, that's explained as part of the shadow of the demon lord, or the shadow falling on the world prompted that. But in my campaign, that's not the case. It was just something that happened, and it happened because the emperor was an idiot. So that's just a byproduct of things that happen in the world that is a consequence to a moronic ruler doing moronic things. So that was alluded to in that campaign, and so I touched on that a bit. But Tales of the Demon Lord takes place pretty much exclusively in the Northern Reach. So for this campaign, as a follow up to that, I wanted to have the campaign set elsewhere in the world, and I wanted it to be a campaign where I introduce more parts of the world to my players. So this campaign is starting in the southern Empire lands. That's a terrible way of putting it. Okay, so you got the Northern Reach. I should have the map up here, but actually I can put the map up. Here we go. Don't pay any attention to that. That's just a map that I'm doing for my next game that I'm running in a couple weeks. But okay, so this would be the Northern Reach. Let me make myself small again. This would be the Northern Reach up here. And so the Empire lands are to the south of that, which is what I meant to say. So, several kingdoms within the Empire: the kingdom of Tyr, the Holy Kingdom, Kingdom of Oldadine, the Freehold of Nar, the Confederacy of the Nine Cities, the Grand Duchy, and so on. So all of these are kingdoms in the Empire, and I wanted to introduce my players to this part of the world, because this is where a lot of the action is actually occurring, and a lot of the chaos is actually occurring down here. Plus, there's some cool stuff down here. The Confederacy of the Nine Cities, they're pretty cool cities, and I wanted to introduce those in this campaign. So I set this second campaign in my mega campaign up to start in the city of Caicrus, which is the capital of the empire, and that is where the Orc uprising occurred. And I started my campaign with the Orc uprising. So I did not actually begin playing in that time frame, because I wanted to move past the initial chaos of the Orc uprising and start moving into what happens after that. What do the orcs do? What does the orc emperor do with his newfound power? And how does that affect the world? So I actually had the session 0 where I introduced the players and their characters to the campaign, and the way that I set it up was that all the characters were in the city of Caicres for some reason, and it was up to them to decide, why they were in the city of Caicres. I didn't want to mess with that. That's really irrelevant in the grand scheme of the campaign, because once the Orc uprising occurs, then whatever they were there for really just, it dies. And their new purpose for being there is to get out. So that's pretty much what happens. They're in Caicres for whatever reason. The Orc uprising occurs, and orcs start slaying humans left and right. So the player characters were part of the survivors that were able to find places to hide in the city during this chaos. And the Orc uprising actually lasted, or the slaughter actually lasted several days. And so for those initial few days, the characters had to move from place to place. They had to hide, and they didn't know each other at this point. They weren't together, so they were in separate parts of the city. And so the way I explained it was that, for several days solid, these orcs are just slaughtering people left and right. They're burning buildings down. They're destroying human monuments. They hated the Church of the New God because the Church of the New God persecuted the orcs and didn't care for their belief in the dark gods. And so the orcs just, pretty much just went haywire for several days. But finally that chaos quelled, and it, the killings for the most part subsided. Now, people afterwards were rounded up. Whatever survivors were found after that weren't slaughtered were rounded up, and they were turned into slaves for the most part, as a fitting sort of revenge for the orcs, who have pretty much been slaves for the last 700, 800 years. So the characters managed to escape being caught, and for moving from place to place, whether they moved around in sewers or whether they moved around in basements of destroyed buildings, hid out in abandoned structures, things like that. So while they managed to survive, they were unable to leave the city because the city was heavily occupied by orcs. And so, there were constant patrols around the perimeter of the city. There was a heavy presence on the streets at all times. And so just moving about was taking a risk for them. So they just struggled to find food and to survive for several months. And so during this time, they got to know each other because they all ended up in one place at some point and decided, to try to figure out a way to escape Caicres, because they were fed up with, trying to just survive and avoid the orcs, and they just wanted to get out. So one of the people that was surviving with them, that had found this place that they were hiding out in, had a good understanding of the sewer system of the city. So they were plotting their escape and they were going to actually go through with their escape through the sewers. But at a crucial point before they actually left, a wizard appeared to them. And this was a person that I described as wearing black robes, hooded. Their face was covered so that you could only see their eyes. They were covered from head to toe. You couldn't even tell what race or what ancestry or what gender they were. But they appeared to the group and basically told them that plan was doomed to fail. And so this wizard offered to help them, but in return, they needed to carry something for him out of the city, him or her. Because at the time, I hadn't really decided if this was going to be a male or female wizard, so I made their gender be very non-specific. They couldn't tell if it was a man or woman even when they were talking. So the group agreed after they felt pretty good that this guy wasn't going to betray them. And they essentially figured out that this was one of the wizards of the Tower Arcane, which is floating above the city of Caicris. Tower Arcane is home to an order of wizards. They came from a far-off land, the land of Is. And the land of Is is, I think, to the northeast. If I remember correctly, it's basically in the northern hemisphere. But it's a legendary land. It's not something that people from this campaign travel to regularly because it's so far away. But there are legends about it, and the legends state basically that the land of Is was a place of great magic, and these wizards came to this continent. The continent's called Rural, R-U-L. The U has a couple dots over it, so I don't know what that is for pronunciation, but I call it Rural. So anyway, the wizards came to this continent seeking a new home. So something happened to the land of Is that caused them to escape. And they never really explained it other than saying that there was a great catastrophe that occurred, causing them to have to abandon their home and find a new home. So they came here and they made a deal with the emperor at the time. And this was several hundred years ago that it occurred. And I don't exactly remember in the timeline when it occurred, but I know it's been several hundred years. And when they made the deal with the emperor of the time, they agreed to take on apprentices from the occupants of, or the citizenry of Rural, provided that they were capable enough to learn the magic of the land of Is. So the emperor agreed, and one of the first things that the wizards the Tower Arcane did was to create the Tower Arcane. And what they did was basically rip a chunk of earth out of the ground and create this massive tower on top of it. And the chunk of earth floats above the city of Caicris, and this tower sits on top of it. And there's actually even a waterfall that comes out of the chunk of earth and kind of sprays down on the city. And this tower essentially makes a circuit around the city, kind of orbits around the city above it. And as it does, this waterfall that pours out of one of the holes in the rock, and kind of just sprays the city throughout the day with this mist of water coming from high above. And so that is how the Wizards of Is came to Caicris. And they've been here for several hundred years, but they pretty much keep to themselves. The only time that they make themselves known is in the court of the emperor. They always have an ambassador that is present. They don't generally interfere in the court of the emperor, but they're mostly there to observe on behalf of the wizards of the Tower Arcane and report back to the wizards of the Tower Arcane. So, and the emperor allowed this as part of the agreement. So, at any rate, this black wizard that presented himself to the player characters really didn't give him a whole lot of information, even though they figured out he was a wizard from the Tower Arcane. He wouldn't say why he needed this favor from them. But he basically said, do this and I will assure your escape from the city. So they agreed because they were fed up with hiding out. And so the Black Wizard gave them a reliquary, which was basically a wooden box very ornately designed, and within it was a single bone from some undetermined creature. And so he asked that they take this out of the city, and at some point he will find them and reclaim the reliquary. So they agreed, and the PC that took it was the priest PC, who is called Brother Aaron. And so Brother Aaron took the reliquary, and the Black Wizard gave them instructions, very specific instructions on when to leave and how to um, move through the city to get to the exit that they would need to go through in order to avoid notice. And so he disappears, mysteriously. And the characters then, follow his instructions when the time comes, and they escape the city. But they do run into an orc patrol. So at this point, they think they're betrayed. The Black Wizard was lying to them the whole time, but then they find out that this orc patrol doesn't see them, even though they basically popped out right in front of them. The orc patrol just keeps walking as if the characters weren't there. So the the PCs, and all the non-player characters that they brought with them, which was about 24, escape Caicrus and head off into the wilderness. And that is where we ended the session 1, or session 0, I should say. And we're going to pick up the first session with them actually traveling through the wilderness. Now, one thing that I do want to mention before I move on from session 0 is that there were a few non-player characters that I introduced. Even though there were a couple of dozen of non-player characters, those were all pretty much red shirts. And I did point out 4, I think it was 4 or 5, named NPCs. So the first one was Mother Sabra, who was a blind priestess of the World Mother. I introduced Gordy, who is a 10-year-old orphan boy, human, who was under the care of the world of Mother Sabra. And then Weezer, who was an alchemist, who is basically an old alchemist, nasty attitude, and basically just hanging out with these guys to get to safety so he can make his own way. And then the last one was with them that was named was Lord Cornwall. Lord Cornwall was a noble that had found his way to their hiding place, and he basically was presented as a pompous asshole. He was, very opinionated, very snobbish, very rude to everybody, believing himself to be above them in stature. And I played him up that way. He was truly a jerk to them. And actually, I say 13 others, so there weren't quite 24. There was about a dozen more besides those 4. So, see, that's why I have my notes, because my memory is shit. So the PCs escape with these characters or with these non-player characters, and find themselves in the wilderness. Now, remember, the wilderness is quite vast, and for this map of Rule, there really isn't a legend that says the distance between point to point, from point to point. So it really leaves it up to you to decide how big you want to make this continent. And I wanted it to be a fairly good-sized continent. So what I did was I went ahead and made each hex 100 miles. So you can see from side to side, the continent is about 1,500 miles wide. And then from the Shield Mountains down to the Patchwork Lands, it is even farther. So let's see. 2,100 miles, and if you keep going, the continent itself, the greater landmass anyway, is 2,600 miles. And then, of course, if you keep going through the blot lands and to the bottom edge of the map, it's 3,000 miles. So it's a pretty good-sized continent, and that doesn't even include the Northern Reach and the Desolation, which are above the Shield Mountains. So, lengthwise, it's pretty big. Even widthwise, it's pretty big. But the actual empire itself is defined from the Shield Mountains over to the Aral Ocean, and that's only 900 miles wide. The rest of this, to the west of the Shield Mountains, is the Endless Steppe. And we're not really doing anything with the Endless Steppe at this point because really the way that it's described in the core rulebook is that it's the home of centaurs, and I think centaurs are kind of lame. So I really don't want to play with a bunch of horsemen, half horsemen. So unless I read another supplement that gives me something cool about this land, I'll probably leave it alone for the majority of this mega campaign. But we'll see. Maybe I will create something interesting over here myself. But for now, the Endless Steppe is being kind of left alone. So where are we? We are at the end of session 0, and the cast of my campaign include Brother Aaron Waverly, who is a human priest of the new god, Callista, who is a Farron rogue, Nikolai Petrechko, who is a human veteran, which is one of the new subclasses of warrior. And then Perry Flaxseed, who is a human hunter, also a subclass of warrior. And so that is my cast. Now, I was a little bit disappointed because I always like there to be a wizard type in the games that I run because I that's my favorite character type. Whenever I get to play, which is not very often, I usually play a wizard because I just think that they have so much. They're just so cool being able to, manipulate magic and the mystery that surrounds them. And it's kind of like the genie in Aladdin. Talks about wielding great cosmic power, and that's kind of how I view wizards. They start off as weak bookworms basically, and then by the end of their career, they're just like, flinging lightning bolts and fireballs and creating arcane storms and summoning monsters from hell and all kinds of goodness. So wizards just have a lot of flavor. I've always loved them, and I just wish that they were represented more in my campaigns. But unfortunately, my players, and I've got 4 regular players, they don't usually like playing wizards for whatever reason. I don't know why. I guess they don't like the bookkeeping. And I get that because it is a lot of work being a wizard, and also trying to keep them alive at low levels is tough. Just because they're pretty, squishy. So I get it, but I still would, I still miss it. So I was a little bit disappointed, but that's okay. This campaign isn't going to last that long anyway. So, maybe in the next one, somebody will man up and pick a wizard. But for now, this is the cast that I have available to me. So, basically a couple of warriors, a rogue, and a priest. And so these characters are leading the 13 refugees that are unnamed, plus the 4 refugees that are named, out of Caicrus and into the wilds of the Empire. So the wilds of the Empire, I think I started to say this before I got distracted with myself, are quite vast. And, of course, not every village or, every settlement is not shown on this map. So I can dot the place with settlements as much as I'd like, but I like to think that the Emperor enjoyed having Caicrus be somewhat isolated from the rest of the kingdom. for their own reasons. And so I purposefully told my players that they're basically going out into the wilderness, and they spend months just roaming the wilderness. Now, of course, any settlements that there would probably be settled along the roads that were built. So let me back up a little bit here and just talk a little bit about my take on the empire. So the empire, there is a Caker's supplement that kind of describes the empire in pretty good detail. But the way that I envision the empire from the things that I've read is that it's kind of another version of the Holy Roman Empire. And so, since the Holy Roman Empire is famous for a lot of their architecture and a lot of their accomplishments, such as roads and bridges and aqueducts and those sorts of things, I wanted to emulate that for the empire in my campaign. So the empire that lasted 800 years, 800 plus years, almost 900 years, they did a lot to try to bring order to the various kingdoms under its rule. And so over the centuries, they built a network of roads throughout the empire. And these are like the Roman roads. They were well built to the point where they didn't need a whole lot of upkeep. They did need occasional upkeeping, but they were better roads than what had preceded them, which was essentially just trails. And so the empire built this network of roads that led to all the major cities, and then any settlements that were between those major cities would have been most likely along the road, so that merchants and other travelers could stop and spend money there, basically. So that's what these black lines represent. Now, is this presented anywhere in the Shadow of the Demon Lord campaign? No, it's not. This is actually something that I drew up myself. And even the city placement for the Confederacy of the Nine Cities, I placed them myself based on what I read in the various supplements for each of these cities and where they are in relation to each other. I could have some of them wrong, but that's okay. This is my campaign now, so if they're not exactly in the right place, I can live with that. So those are where I place the cities, and then I haven't placed the other major cities of the campaign because this particular campaign doesn't really pertain to those cities as of yet. When the players left, they were basically here. Whoops, they were in Cakerus, which I placed on the map right there. And so when they left, they really took kind of a southeasterly route to avoid the roads, because the roads would be patrolled by orcs. And they wanted to avoid the orc patrols at all costs. So they went through in the wilderness in between the roads, and that's all of this empty land. So you have hundreds of miles and probably hundreds of thousands of square miles, if not more, of wilderness that they were walking through. So they were on foot. They had old people and children with them, and so it took them many months of travel through this wilderness to make it from Cakerus to the border of, or to a close proximity of the border to the Confederacy of the Nine Cities. And that is where I picked up the first adventure. So let me go back to my blogger here and go back and show you my session one. Now, the first adventure, I actually used the Huntsman Isle as the baseline for that adventure. So I took the map and I took a lot of the stuff in that adventure and used it in mine. However, I altered it quite a bit as well. So my Huntsman's Isle doesn't really look a whole lot like the one that was published. But at any rate, for this adventure, it actually lasted 3 sessions. And my goal was to try to end each session, or try to end each adventure at the end of the session. But what I quickly realized is that it's really difficult to do that, because my group only plays once a week, and we only play for 3 hours online. And that is including any small talk that we have, just catching up from what's gone on in our personal lives over the week. And it also includes any technical difficulties, which unfortunately occurs when you're playing online. So, on a good night, we'll get maybe 2.5 hours of play in. So it's challenging to really complete an adventure from start to finish, and have it be a meaningful adventure with enough detail to make it satisfying for me, and to a lesser degree for the players. But I need to feel like I didn't rush through something just for the sake of doing an adventure in a session. Now, if I were to be able to run a session that was 4 or 5 hours long, or maybe even 6 hours long, I probably could have finished this in one session. But since I'm working with a weekly 2.5 to 3 hour session online, then I just I did what I could with it, and I had ended up having this one adventure broken out into 3 sessions. And so they didn't level up until after the third session, which Shadow of the Demon Lord, you level up after each session, supposedly. But my milestone is you don't level up until you finish the adventure. And so this adventure was a Huntsman's Isle. And the quest that they ended up with, which forms the basis of the adventure, and gives them the goals that they need to satisfy the adventure. Those were presented in the first session. And so during that session, the players and their characters had traveled through the wilderness, and they had had a difficult time surviving. Foraging and things like that is basically how they managed to survive. But even that was starting to wear on them, because they'd been out there many months. Now, at some point during their travels, they had encountered a very strange sight, and that was a huge sinkhole had formed after an earthquake hit, and then an enormous creature rose up out of the sinkhole and just started walking off, or stomping off in to the south of the players where they were witnessing this. And so this monster didn't interact with them at all. It didn't even notice they were there, because it was a gargantuan, several hundred feet tall monster. And so the reason that I put this interlude into the game was to set up the theme for this campaign. And the theme is, I think I mentioned this in my previous video. The theme of this campaign is the rise of the monsters, because of the awakening, or the I don't want to say summoning. I think awakening is a better term. The awakening of the mother of monsters. And so the mother of monsters awakening results in all of these slumbering titans being released into the world. And so by the end of this campaign, it's basically going to be a Godzilla world with these gargantuan monsters, just finding places to sleep for the most part, but then they come out and have periods of activity where they destroy all kinds of shit. So to set that up, I had to have them witness the emergence of one of these titans. And so they did, from a distance, a safe distance, but they saw it come out. So they're like scratching their head going, okay, well, that's not something you see every day. And we just left it at that. Shortly thereafter, they went to the they continued on traveling towards the border of the empire, hoping to cross over into um, the Confederacy of the Nine Cities. And so before they got there, they had seen signs of orc patrols in the area, and they were pretty recent signs. So they were concerned that orcs were going to catch them and drag them back to Caicres. So they were kind of looking for a place to hunker down anyway, and they come across this river that has an island situated in the center of it. And the island is forested, but it does have some structures on it. And from the shore of the river, they can see that these structures include a keep, a series of standing stones, and also some other buildings. So it looks like either town or some sort of settlement. And so they decide to go over there to see what they can, essentially see if they can get some supplies, rest up, and seek some sanctuary from the orcs. So giving the orcs time to move on, and so that they can continue on more safely. So they leave the NPCs on the shore of the river, and the four heroes of the story cross the river and go to the keep. And when they get to the keep, they do some exploration, and they find that the keep has a ghost. The ghost is a former noble whose family used to live in the keep and used to oversee this island and the people that had settled on it. And so the excuse me, the noble, and I forget his name, but the family name is Stosica. And so the noble himself appears to the heroes and basically says that he will show them where his family stash is, the family treasure, where it's hidden, if they do him a favor by clearing the corruption that has appeared on the island. And he's not specific about the corruption because he's kind of trapped in this ruined keep, and so he can't venture out of it to find out what the corruption is, but he can sense it. And the sensing, the corruption that has come to his island has really brought his spirit back and trapped it here in the keep. So he implores them to aid him in destroying the corruption that has pervaded the island. Is that a word, pervaded? Probably not. That has invaded his island. And so they agree because, they want loot. And so as part of the agreement, they asked if the ghost would watch over their traveling companions. So the ghost agreed. They leave the keep to go get the other NPCs, or to go get the NPCs, when two monsters appear to them. And they were two mastiffs that had belonged to the ghost of the Baron Stosica, who died 200 or 300 years ago. And these mastiffs had mutated into some bastardization of a mastiff. So they were huge, hulking mastiff beasts, basically. And so the heroes had to fight them, and so they did, and they managed to kill them. Once they did, they got the NPCs, brought them over, and then they proceeded to keep them hidden. There's the map of the island. And so they start doing some investigating. They start exploring the island, and they find the burial grounds, which are close to the keep, and it's kind of small. I'm sure you probably can't see very well, but that's where the keep is, and then the burial grounds are over here, and they're actually mounds, burial mounds. where the Stosica family had buried their ancestors. But when they get there, they find a strange pool of liquid right in the middle of the burial grounds. And when they approach the liquid, monsters begin forming out of it. And so this, they find that they have to fight the monsters, and they kill a couple of monsters before they figure that the monsters are being created every time they approach the pool. And so they decide to avoid the pool, and they kind of start looking around the area for signs of any other monsters, and they find lots of tracks, but they don't spot any monsters at this point. So they decide then to well, actually, that was the end of the session. So for the next session, which continued on the island, Huntsman's Island, they started to do some exploration of the island. So they left the burial mounds. They explored the standing stones, which were erected to honor the Old Faith, because the Stosica family venerated the Old Faith. And so that's what the standing stones were for, but they're very, very worn. So it appears that whatever protective qualities these stones may have once had were probably greatly diminished due to the weather-worn nature of the stones. So that's one thing that they had found. They also found some ruins of the Baron's vassals, of the nobles' vassals, and they were then attacked by a number of multi-armed creatures, which were boggarts, I believe. And so they didn't really want to mess with that area too much. They continued searching the island, and they found a boathouse, and a bunch of beastmen had basically just arrived on the island and were searching the boathouse when the hero spotted them. And so the heroes went up and basically took care of the Fomor and killed them all. And then they went on to search the burial mounds again. And so this time they actually searched the mounds and found that each mound had a capstone on it. And the capstone indicated who was buried in that mound. And so when they removed the capstone, they found that there was a hole in the mound that had a ladder below it that led down into a subterranean tomb. And so they went down into the tomb and started looking around, and that's when they were attacked by a tomb guardian, which was an undead creature that I had down there that was tasked basically to protect the family remains and the treasures buried with them. And so the heroes fought this tomb guardian, which was a pretty tough fight, and they had a really difficult time with it. But they did finally manage to destroy it, not before finding another monster in another part of this tomb, and also uncovering some troglodytes that were down there. And so they ended this session by leaving the catacombs and going back to the keep to check on the NPCs and to rest, because all of this basically took pretty much a full day. And so they were going to go back and rest. But when they go back to the keep, they find that Lord Cornwall, the asshole noble, decided he wasn't going to let these four characters make off with the loot and leave them stranded in this ruined keep. So he was going to go find where the noble's treasures were hidden himself. And so before the heroes got back, he had taken off and made his way to the burial mounds that they had just left. And of course, when the heroes return to the keep, they're told that he left and several hours ago, and he has not returned. And so, of course, now the heroes feel responsible for him leaving, and they decide that they're going to figure out if they're going to pursue him or not, and so they decide to leave. Well, that's in the next session. So we ended the session with them returning to the Cape, and so the third and last part of this adventure um, was the heroes going back to the keep, finding out that Lord Cornwall had left, um, and okay, so okay, so sorry, I had to pause there for a second because I'm trying to remember exactly how this happened. So I don't remember if in the second session they went back to the mounds. Cornwall. Yeah, okay. So they actually had returned to the keep, found out that Cornwall had gone AWOL. They go back to the mounds in the second session and find Lord Cornwall, and he was actually um, being violated by the troglodytes. It's all coming back to me now. Okay, so that was in session 2. So and that's where they had a really hard time with the Tomb Guardian. Okay, so in session 3 and the third part of the Huntsman's Isle, they rush Cornwall back to the keep so that Mother Sabra can attend to him. But they figured out that the monsters that were on the island were all coming from the catacombs underneath the burial mounds, because during their exploration and fighting the Tomb Guardian, they had seen a big symbol painted on the floor of the central chamber, and they had encountered the troglodytes, and so they decided to go back there and see if tampering with that symbol would do something to stop the monsters from continuing to appear. And so they did return to the catacombs. They snuck down there. They fought troglodytes. They encountered a troglodyte spellcaster, and this was a particularly difficult challenge for them because a spellcaster could cast pretty powerful spells, and he cast them from the Forbidden Tradition. And so Brother Aaron, unfortunately, took the brunt of the spellcaster's attacks, and he actually fell victim to a forbidden spell called, what's it called? I forget what the spell is called, but basically what it does is it makes your junk fall off. So Brother Aaron's junk fell off or melted off, and so that obviously the character or the player that was running the character was really actually all the players were kind of taken aback by that, because that's pretty brutal and it's pretty gross. And so he was grievously wounded, and so the other characters had to kill the spellcaster off. But during the fight, Callista, the Farron rogue, had wandered off, and a troglodyte had followed her. And during their fight, she fell. So the troglodyte was going to take her and make him his mate. So he was basically dragging her by the hair deeper into the catacombs to have his way with her. And so the other heroes had to hunt Callista down and stop the troglodyte before he violated her, which they did, thankfully. They then looted the tomb, and got their stuff. They ruined the ritual that the troglodyte spellcaster had running down there, and the symbol that they found, they learned later because of some of the characters' backgrounds, that the symbol belonged to a dark god that is known as the Mother of Monsters. And so somehow this symbol was summoning monsters and populating the island with monsters, and it was corrupting the place. So by them disrupting the ritual and basically erasing the symbol, that caused the pool above the surface to evaporate, and that resulted in the monsters basically fading away. So the quest was resolved. They go back to the keep. They find that the ghost went to his final resting place. So the ghost really never told them where the family loot was, but they raided the family tomb anyway. So it's unlikely, if the ghost would have stuck around, that he would have told them where the family treasure is, because they violated his ancestors' graves, basically. So that I made that be their reward for taking on this quest. And so at this point, the Mother Sabra and the 13 NPCs decide that they're going to stay on the island, and the heroes decide that they're going to leave. And they actually are being paid by Lord Cornwall to take him to his family in the one of the cities of one of the 9 cities of the Confederacy. And I forgot to mention this earlier, but he was actually paying them, or he said he was going to pay them for their protection if they would accompany him to the City of Gold, which is called Kem. And so that's where they were trying to make their way to when they stopped off at the Stosica Island. And so he still wanted to leave. And of course, he was very grievously wounded, because as part of the ritual, the troglodytes took his tongue, and they also did some unspeakable things to other parts of his body. And so he was in sad shape. So he needed to get to civilization anyway, so that he could get ongoing care for his disabilities now. And so the heroes, honor their original agreement with him, take him off the island, and they continue their travels through the wilderness towards the City of Gold. And that's where the first adventure, the Huntsman's Isle, ends, and where the heroes finally level up and get to 2nd level. So that is where I'm going to end tonight's video. And I wanted to give you the whole story from the start of the campaign through the end of the first adventure, which unfortunately took several sessions, and that's why this video is so long. So apologize for that. I don't normally like having my videos be more than, say, 30 minutes, but I felt that it was important to go through all this to keep it all keep the story together. All right, so next time when I come back to my campaign diaries, which I don't know if I'm just going to do these in succession or if I'm going to, spread them out. But next time we will talk about the next time I do a campaign diary, I'll talk about my 4th session, in which we actually make it to a suburb of the City of Gold. And it's a town called Nor Egerts. And it was an interesting adventure, so I can't wait to tell you about it. But anyway, I've talked your ears off. My voice is starting to get scratchy, so it's time for me to go. And I got stuff going on up in here, so that I got to take care of that. So anyway, thanks for your viewage, your watchage. I don't know how to put that. Thanks for watching, I guess. And I'll catch up with you guys next time. Until then, hail. How do I turn this damn thing off?